Hey, welcome to Caritas Querens. So, in this series, I'm taking a look at some of the big ideas and words that you hear a lot in Christianity and trying to look at them from a different perspective and hopefully shed some light and maybe get a deeper and more meaningful understanding of these words and ideas. And in this video, I'd like to tackle the word law. Now, I got to say, from my own personal experience, especially in dealing with scrupulosity, this has been a big thorn in my flesh. um, and I have struggled for many years to try to understand the word law. One of the things that keeps coming up to me, and one thing that I've struggled with a lot, is, for instance, reading in the Old Testament. Obviously, there is an emphasis in many parts of the Old Testament on law. And one of the things that always baffled me, actually, is one of the Psalms, Psalm 119, which is, you may know, is the longest psalm by far. It's 176 verses. It's an acrostic psalm where it's broken into groups of 8 verses, and each group of 8 verses starts with one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes all the way from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z, so to speak. And throughout this beautiful psalm, this exquisitely structured psalm, is this theme of how much the psalmist loves God's law. And I got to say, I often would hear that and read that and think, okay, I wish I could say that, but honestly, law is not the kind of thing that makes me want to burst into song and praise. So over the years, I've tried to do some research into this and study this more. And so, first of all, let's take a look at the words that are used in the original Hebrew and Greek for law. If you go back to the original Hebrew, the main word for law is the word Torah. And of course, that gets applied, especially in a special way, to the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the heart of the Old Testament, the Torah. But what's interesting is that in Hebrew, the word Torah does not originally seem to mean what we would call law. It comes from a Hebrew root, yara, which seems to mean something like to point out. And so from that, many scholars have concluded that the basic meaning of Torah is to point something out. In other words, instruction, or you might say education. Okay? Now, when you see it that way, I mean, first of all, let's take the first 5 books of the Bible. How much of them is even what we would call law? Well, I don't know. I haven't done the percentage or anything, but it's got to be way less than half, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot of laws in Genesis, first of all. That's mostly narrative. Obviously, there's some laws in Exodus, but it's not even the majority of the book. Leviticus, okay, that's mostly laws. Numbers, there's some. Deuteronomy, there's some. But by far, most of the Torah is not what we would call laws. So why would the Israelites call these 5 books the Torah, the law, when law itself, or what we call law, actually makes up a fairly small section of those books? But if we call it instruction, that's very illuminating, isn't it? Because, in fact, the first 5 books of the Bible are very instructive. They are very educational. In fact, many people would say that if we had nothing else, only the Torah, in a sense, that would be enough. I mean, I would hate to lose the Psalms and the prophets and the rest of the history of Israel and the wisdom literature. I would hate to lose that. But in some ways, the Torah would be enough. All the germs of what we believe are there. It is the instruction par excellence. It is the Torah, the instruction. Now, when I see it that way, certainly I can sympathize with the psalmist and praise God's law to the high heavens. Yes, God's law is amazing. God's instruction, that is amazing and is wonderful. In fact, we might almost say that it's tantamount to the word revelation. What is revelation but God revealing himself and revealing his will and revealing understanding to us? And so his instruction is God himself revealing himself to us and revealing his will for us. So in a sense, I think you could almost say that Torah, the meaning of Torah, is revelation itself. God's self-revealing and God's revealing of who we are and how he has created us to be. That is a wonderful thing. In fact, there's this great line from St. Augustine where he cries out, ut conioverim te, ut conioverim me. He says, that I might know you and that I might know myself. Those are the 2 great things that we ought to desire. And so that is what God reveals to us. That is the instruction. That is the Torah. That is something that I would love to praise. Now, in the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament and in the Greek New Testament, the word that's used that we often translate as law is the Greek word nomos. Now, here, the word nomos does seem oftentimes, it often has the sense of what we would call law, but not, again, not originally. The original import of the word seems to be more like a common usage or a custom. Okay, so a law in the sense of something that, by common usage, people follow. Now, think about it. When people have customs or common usages, why do they have them? Is it because some group of legislators got together and decided this is the way it's going to be? Or is it because these are things which, in some way, instruct us about the reality of the life we live? For instance, take customs like, I don't know, the Christmas customs, like a Christmas tree, okay? Or decorating with a star at Christmas time. The college I went to, they had this custom of having these beautiful, many-pointed stars that apparently it all started as a project that some teacher gave his students and to construct this elaborate geometrical figure, and they came up with this beautiful, I forget how many points there are, many-pointed star. Now, why do we do these things? Is it because somebody said, you better do this or else? No, it's because these are customs that have been passed down, and they have meaning. They help to illuminate the meaning of Christmas for us. They instruct us. So even there, I think really a case could be made that even in the Greek word, there's much more than just our sense of a legal law. There's the sense of a custom, of something that has been perpetuated and handed down because it is instructive for us. And moreover, it's the same word that's used in the Greek Old Testament translation, the Septuagint, to translate the word Torah. So if Torah means instruction, and the early Christians were reading the Old Testament, sometimes many of them in Greek, and reading the word nomos, then it makes sense that that same Hebrew idea of instruction would be carried over into the Greek understanding in the New Testament of nomos, or law, as instruction. Now, it's interesting because in researching this and thinking about this, pondering this, something else came to my mind, and that is the perpetuity of law. Now, in the Old Testament, it's pretty common teaching that there are three different types of laws that are in the Old Testament. And I see no reason to disregard this. I think it seems like it's common sense, it seems logical. So many scholars, Catholic and Protestant, will say that there are basically three types of laws in the Old Testament. Okay, there are, first of all, moral laws. And moral laws are basically laws that express absolutes of right and wrong, things that are intrinsically right or wrong. Okay, and they are akin to many Christian theologians and scholars would say it's basically expressions of what we call the natural law. In other words, this is not just God saying this is right and wrong and you got to follow it, but this is God saying this is what is intrinsically right or wrong, intrinsically good or bad for you. Okay, it kind of reminds me of what St. Paul says when he says, all things are lawful for us, but not all things are useful. Okay, so you can look at things, you can look at right and wrong from the perspective of law and say, okay, well, is it a law or not? But you can also look at it as, is it something that's good for you or not? And these moral laws are expressions of what is good for you or not, what is useful or not. Okay. The second type is called ceremonial law, and these are laws that have to do with worship, for instance. So laws about sacrifices and ritual cleanness, and laws also that kind of set the Israelites apart. So many would include in ceremonial laws things like dietary laws as well, and the law of the Sabbath and circumcision and so on. And then finally are the judicial laws, and these are laws that we might say were prudential laws, civic laws of society, laws that helped the Israelite society to run more smoothly. These would include, for instance, laws that dealt with day-to-day things. So, like, if you steal something, here's what you should do to make reparation. Rules like, here's a sanctuary law. If somebody kills somebody by accident, you can go here and you can receive sanctuary. Rules like that. Okay. Now, many scholars say that when St. Paul talks about how the law has been made obsolete, they say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that we can do whatever we want? I mean, St. Paul doesn't say that, right? St. Paul says that still all things are maybe lawful, but not all things are useful. And he says that we should not just continue to sin that grace may abound. He says, God forbid, very strongly. So many scholars then draw the distinction. They say, well, things like the ceremonial laws and the judicial laws, they were laws that were there for a particular time and people. Okay, so at the time the Israelites were, in the promised land, the judicial laws were prudent for them, and it was good for them to follow them. The ceremonial laws, while the temple was still standing and God was being worshipped, these laws were useful for them. But for us, I mean, we don't have the Temple of Jerusalem anymore. We don't have the imperfect sacrifices of lambs and bulls and so on anymore. And we don't live in the Holy Land. We live in a different land where our civic laws ought to be different because the circumstances are different. So they say, well, those laws don't apply anymore because they were never meant to be perennial. They were only meant for a certain people at a certain time, under certain circumstances. But they say the moral law, well, technically you could say that the moral law is obsolete, but because it basically is an expression of natural law, it's an expression of what is intrinsically right or wrong, what is inherently good or bad for us, in that sense, it can never be made obsolete because it is tied in with who we are, with how we were created to be and to live. So in that sense, they say, yeah, you can say that the law is obsolete, but the moral law can never be in and of itself obsolete because the principles that it expresses are really part of us. They're written into our hearts, and so we can never get away from them. You could choose to disobey or disregard the law of murder, but the reality is that in doing that, you are violating the sacredness of human life, and it's going to have natural consequences on you, like it or not. As St. Augustine said, the murderer really kills himself more than he kills his victim. The liar lies more to himself than he lies to his victim. The thief steals more from himself than he steals from his victim, and so on. Okay, and I think there's a beautiful truth in that, a profound truth in that. What I would like to say is, the next question that people sometimes ask is, if that's the case, then why do we still read the Old Testament? If the moral laws just express our natural law, which we can, philosophers say and theologians say, we can apprehend, we can understand that using reason. A lot of it just seems to be common sense to us. And the ceremonial laws, if they don't apply, the judicial laws, they don't apply, then why do we study that? Why do we read that? Why do we still consider it inspired and think of it as useful and relevant to us? Well, the answer that is often given is that even though those laws may not apply to us directly anymore, they are still instructive for us. So the laws of sacrifice, for instance, are instructive of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. In other words, they shed light on who he is and what he did for us. The judicial laws, oftentimes they still show us important principles that might be useful for us to follow. And they teach us about justice. They teach us about mercy. So, in other words, what people say is that these laws, even the laws that are obsolete, are still useful for us because they are instructive. In other words, they are Torah, they are instruction, right? What about the moral laws? We tend to see the moral laws, or we tend to see natural moral law as something that is just binding. It's an obligation. So even once we get past St. Paul saying that the law is obsolete, that all things are lawful, but not all things are useful, and we say, well, you don't have to follow the laws of sacrifice and the ceremonial ritual laws anymore and the judicial laws, they don't apply to you anymore, but you still got to follow the natural moral laws. That's still binding. You're still obligated by that. And I would like to suggest another way of seeing it. I'm not saying that it's good to disobey those laws, but I would like to say that if we're going to say that the ceremonial and judicial laws are still relevant because they are instructive, could we not also say that the moral laws, that natural moral law, is important primarily, first and foremost, because it is instructive for us? Let's take a look by analogy at what I'm going to call physical laws, or let's say scientific laws, laws of the physical world, like law of gravity, or laws of magnetism, or aerodynamics. The reality is, that these are things, these are really principles. They're truths. It's instruction. People come to the understanding of these so-called laws not as if somebody got together, a bunch of scientists got together and said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could make a law that bodies that have mass tend to be attracted to each other? Wouldn't it be cool if there was such a thing as a magnet, some kind of metallic substance that would attract some other kinds of metals, and they passed a law and they said, boom, magnetism in effect, starting now, gravity in effect, starting now. That's not the way it worked, right? These are laws that are really, that express principles that are there in the natural world. They're instructive, okay? They're descriptive, not prescriptive. Nobody is saying, I have hereby passed the law of gravity and you are bound to obey it or else you will be punished. Nobody's saying that. It's not a prescription, it's a description. People are saying, this is the way the natural world works. And it would behoove you to understand this. Because if you don't, or if you choose to disregard it, it will have consequences. And if I choose to walk off of a 30-story building, the law of gravity, I could defy it all I want. It's still there, and it's still going to have consequences on me. And I'm going to experience those consequences very quickly and very painfully. But the flip side is that the more I understand those principles or those laws, the more freedom I gain. It is only by understanding laws like aerodynamics and gravity, for instance, that inventors and scientists have been able to invent the ability to fly, for instance. Isn't that an amazing thing? So what if we were to see natural moral law like that as well? Instead of seeing it, I mean, I've often read and I've often heard people say okay, that's a good way of understanding the physical laws of nature, but the natural moral laws, they don't work like that because they're tied in with our human choices, and therefore we are responsible and we are going to pay the price if we disobey them. But what if we see the natural moral laws kind of like we see the natural physical laws or scientific laws? For instance, what if we see the law of murder, or rather the law against murder? What if we see it not as God saying, you're not allowed to kill anybody, okay? And if you do, you're going to be punished for it. But what if we see it as God instructing us, Torah, and saying, look, the way I've made you, you're made in my image. You are destined for union with me. Your life, therefore, is sacred. And if you don't know that, or you disregard it, or you defy it, and you act contrary to that principle, and you take an innocent life, there's going to be consequences. Not consequences that, are going to be inflicted upon you arbitrarily, but there are going to be natural consequences, and you're going to suffer those consequences. Not because God is a ruthless tyrant or vindictive, but because God has created us this way. And if we are acting contrary to the way we were created, if we're acting as beings created in God's image and likeness, destined for union with Him, with lives that are sacred, and if we're acting as if that's not the case, then guess what? It's going to be like walking off a 30-story building because we don't believe in gravity or we want to defy gravity. It's going to have consequences, not because God says so, but because that is how we are created, because that's the way things are. But the flip side is true too. If we acknowledge those truths and we try to live according to them, why then it grants us a great freedom. The moment I start seeing other people as created in God's image and likeness, the moment I start treating them as destined for union with God, the moment I start treating their lives as sacred, oh my relationships can flower abundantly. And I can have much more meaningful relationships with others, and in fact, those relationships can even help me to develop in my own personhood. And we could take a look at all kinds of other moral laws and see similar effects and consequences. But what if we see it that way? And what if we see that all of God's moral law, not just the ceremonial and judicial, but all of it is meant first and foremost for our instruction, so that God might teach us who we are and what the world that He created is like, and who He is, and how we are meant to relate to Him and relate to others and created in His image. What if we see it that way? And it's not about whether or not I break the law. It's not about whether or not I get punished, but it's about being instructed. It's about God warning us so that we won't have to suffer the consequences of being ignorant or defiant, but also God giving us the opportunity to grow in knowledge and understanding and wisdom, so that in fact by that law, by that instruction, by that Torah, we might actually be developed. We might actually be perfected. Well, anyway, if you have found this helpful or interesting at all, I would appreciate if you would like and subscribe and share with others that might also be interested in this video. And as always, please, please share your feedback. I always love to get comments and feedback from people, even if it's comments that challenge me. In fact, sometimes those are the most useful. In fact, I would say most of the time, those are the most useful. Until next time, adios.